Thomas Rigg had just enough stew for one man and no reason to make more. So when the knock came, low and uncertain, he almost didn't answer. He sat still at the table, spoon halfway to his mouth, listening. Outside, the wind scraped across the empty prairie like a dull blade. It was the only voice he'd heard in days, maybe weeks. Another knock, this one softer, like whoever was knocking didn't want to be heard, or didn't expect to be let in. Thomas stood slow, joints cracking, spine stiff from cold and time. He crossed the cabin floor with the kind of caution that didn't come from fear, just habit. The kind of habit a man forms after losing too much. He opened the door. A boy stood there. No hat, coat torn down one sleeve, mud up to his knees. His face was thin, drawn tight over cheekbones that hadn't seen meat in days. Maybe longer. "You lost?" Thomas asked. The boy didn't answer, just looked at him with eyes too old for his face. Thomas didn't ask again. He just stepped aside. The boy hesitated, like a wild thing weighing a trap, then stepped in slow. His boots left small, wet prints on the wood floor. Thomas shut the door behind him. The stew still sat on the table, steam fading. There wasn't much, just beans, salt, and one sliver of pork belly, but it was warm, and it was something. He picked up a second bowl from the shelf. Dust fell from it as he wiped it clean with his sleeve. The boy didn't thank him, didn't sit until Thomas motioned to the chair. They ate in silence. The kind that doesn't need breaking. Thomas studied the boy over the rim of his tin cup. Maybe 20, maybe younger. Hands were cut up, calloused, not from farming, from rope, from running. His eyes kept darting to the window like the dark was watching him back. "Name?" Thomas asked. The boy didn't look up. "Jude. Where you headed?" "Don't know." Thomas nodded once. That was answer enough. The wind howled harder outside, like something alive. Snow spit against the window, rattling the old glass. Thomas leaned back in his chair. Jude had stopped eating, though his bowl wasn't empty, like he didn't trust his own luck. "You sleep by the fire," Thomas said, pointing to the mat near the hearth. "Gets colder than a promise out here at night." Jude didn't smile, just nodded, took off his coat, folded it with care, and lay down without a word. Thomas watched him for a long moment, then tossed another log on the fire. Sparks leapt, cracked, hissed like they were telling secrets. He went to bed without saying goodnight. But sleep didn't come easy, not with a stranger on the floor and the kind of silence that carries weight. Sometime deep into the night, Thomas rose, stepped to the window, looked out. Nothing but wind, nothing but dark. But in his gut, he felt it that this boy hadn't come alone. Morning came slow and gray, the kind of light that didn't warm, just showed how cold the world still was. Thomas stirred the fire with the iron poker, watching coals glow like old bones. The boy Jude was still asleep near the hearth, curled on his side like something half-starved and thawing. He hadn't stirred once in the night. Outside, the wind had calmed, but the land hadn't. There was a stillness to it. Not peace, the kind of quiet that listens for something. Thomas poured the last of the coffee grounds into the pot, set it over the flame. The cupboard behind him was near bare now. A few beans, 2 biscuits hard as stone, a half sack of flour he'd been saving for nothing in particular. He looked down at the boy, or the man. He wasn't sure which yet. Jude sat up like someone used to waking afraid. His eyes darted to the door, then to the windows, then to Thomas. "You sleep like a dead man," Thomas said. Jude didn't smile, but he didn't flinch either. "Didn't think I'd be warm again," he said. Thomas poured coffee into 2 tin mugs. No sugar, no cream, just bitter heat. He handed one over. Jude took it with both hands like it might vanish. They sat in silence again, different than the night before. Not a stranger's silence, a waiting one. Thomas watched him closely this time, the way his shoulders tensed at every gust, the way he held the mug close but didn't drink until Thomas did first. "You ran from something," Thomas said, not a question. Jude looked into the fire. I ran long enough to forget what from, he said. Only remember who. Thomas didn't press. He'd known men like that. Boys, too. After a while, the details weren't the weight. It was the running itself. By midday, the sun peeked out just long enough to fool the chickens into scratching at Frost. Thomas saddled his mare, checked the traps near the stream. Nothing caught. Snow-covered tracks. Or maybe something smarter passed through. When he returned, Jude had swept the hearth, was splitting kindling with the hatchet from beside the door. He wasn't good at it, but he was trying. Thomas watched him a moment before stepping onto the porch. That's when he saw them. Not people. Tracks. Fresh ones. Circling the cabin. Just wide enough to stay out of easy sight. Hoof prints. Multiple. They hadn't been there at sunrise. He crouched. Pressed a hand to one. The edge was sharp. No snowmelt. Just frost. Recent. He straightened slowly. The wind whispered again, but this time it sounded like breath. Back inside, Jude looked up like he already knew. You expecting someone? Thomas asked. Jude hesitated too long. No? You sure? Another pause. They're not mine, Jude said finally, but they'll think I am. Thomas didn't ask more. He moved to the window, watched the ridge in the distance. Nothing stirred, but he knew the signs. This wasn't a robbery. This was a warning. They hadn't knocked, they hadn't called out. They were waiting. That night, dinner was half a biscuit each, and a thin broth that didn't taste like much. The fire burned low. Thomas lit it. Jude sat with his back to the wall, eyes half-lidded, one hand near the hatchet handle. Thomas sat in his chair, boots planted firm, rifle leaning against the frame. Neither man spoke for a long time. Then Jude said, "They'll come back. Maybe tonight. Maybe at dawn." Thomas nodded once. Who are they? Jude stared into the flames like the answer might flicker there. Drake Brothers, he said. Riders for hire. They take contracts, collect debts, hunt things people don't want found. Thomas's jaw clenched. What'd you steal? I didn't steal anything, Jude said. I left. Sometimes that was worse. Thomas leaned back, the old wood of his chair groaning under him. He looked at Jude for a long time, took in the bruises on his neck, the crack in his lower lip, the way he flinched when the logs popped too loud. You were theirs, he said. Jude nodded once. Not anymore. Thomas didn't say he believed him, but he didn't say he didn't. He just stared into the fire and listened to the wind start to howl again. The next morning, Thomas didn't light the fire. He just sat in his chair, mug cold in his hand, staring out the window like the trees might speak first. Jude hadn't moved much since sunrise. He sat on the floor again, knees pulled in, eyes fixed on the blank wall across from him, like he was waiting for something to come through it. Neither of them had much to say, but the silence didn't feel like the night before. It felt tighter now, heavier. Not the kind that rests, the kind that holds its breath. Thomas finally stood, moved around the cabin like a man checking things he already knew. The stew pot was empty, the cupboard still thin. His Winchester hung above the door, oiled but untouched. He didn't reach for it, not yet. He stepped outside. The wind was low, the sky heavy with gray. Frost clung to the branches of the oak beside the barn. And there in the snow, the tracks were clearer now. Riders. 7, maybe 8. Wide formation, careful spacing. They hadn't come close enough to shoot, but close enough to see. He went back inside, boots leaving wet marks across the wood. Jude looked up, face unreadable. How many? He asked. Thomas set the tin cup down, didn't answer right away. Enough, he said. Too many for a visit. Jude nodded, then looked away. Midday passed like a breath held too long. Jude swept the floor again, folded the blanket by the hearth, chopped more wood, this time with fewer mistakes. Thomas worked on the saddle straps. His hands knew the motions, but his mind drifted. The boy moved like someone used to being watched, not trusted, not wanted. Yet everything he did with care, like maybe he still believed small things could keep a man alive. Thomas saw it, but he didn't say anything. By late afternoon, the clouds thickened and the sky turned the color of old bruises. Thomas stood near the coop, checking wire, when he caught sight of Jude again. The boy was by the stream, crouched low, hands buried in the snow. He wasn't drinking. He was shaking. Thomas walked over slow, didn't say a word, just stood beside him. Jude wiped his face fast, too fast to hide it. "I was with them for a year," he said, voice low. "Maybe more. You lose count after a while." Thomas waited. "They don't keep you alive unless you're useful, and even then it's just until something better comes along." He turned to Thomas then, and his eyes looked hollow like a man still halfway underground. "I didn't steal anything. I didn't kill anyone. I just left. Thought I could disappear." Thomas looked toward the ridge. The trees hadn't moved, but they felt closer. "Men like that don't lose things easy," he said. "They ate nothing that night. Not because there wasn't anything left, but because neither of them had the stomach for it." Thomas sat by the fire with his rifle across his knees, not aimed, just resting. Jude sat cross-legged near the corner, carving into a scrap of pine with the small pocket knife Thomas had handed him earlier. The boy hadn't asked for it, but he'd taken it with quiet hands. "What are you making?" Thomas asked. Jude didn't look up. "Nothing good," he said. "Just trying to remember how." The fire cracked. Wind pressed against the cabin like breath against glass. Thomas thought about asking more questions. Where Jude had come from, what they'd done to him, why he hadn't just kept running. But instead he said, "My boy was 16 when he left. War took him. Never said where. Never said why." Jude looked up. Carving stopped. "Did he come back?" Thomas shook his head once. "Never knew if he tried." For a while, there was only the sound of wind. Then Jude said, "You think they'll come tonight?" Thomas looked into the flames. The wood popped like it had something to say. "Maybe," he said. "Or maybe they're just waiting to see what kind of men we are." Jude wrapped himself in the old quilt by the hearth, not sleeping, just still. Thomas sat in his chair, hands steady on the rifle, gaze never leaving the window. Outside, the trees whispered to each other in the dark. And somewhere in that wind, a branch snapped. The fire had burned down to coals by the time Thomas finally stood. The air inside the cabin was heavy, too warm to be comforting. He stepped outside without his coat, letting the cold scrape across his skin. It helped him think. The trees along the ridge hadn't changed, but the shadows between them had. He'd lived on this land long enough to know when it was holding its breath. Now, it was doing more than that. It was listening. He moved quietly down the steps, eyes on the ground. Snow was light but fresh enough to catch a print. There near the side of the barn, a scuff in the frost, not from his boots. Smaller, lighter. He followed it to the edge of the tree line. Then it vanished. Wiped clean. That wasn't nature. That was caution. Inside, Jude sat near the hearth, still carving, still quiet. He didn't look up when Thomas entered, but his hands had stopped moving. "They're closer," Thomas said. Jude nodded. "They won't ride in guns up, not at first." "You know that for sure?" Jude looked up, and for once his voice held something steady. "I know them." Thomas poured the last of the coffee. No words passed between them. The room felt small now, like the walls had pulled in. "You got a plan?" Thomas asked. "Only one I've ever had." "Which is?" Jude's eyes flicked toward the door. "Don't die." They checked the cabin together. Not hurried, not frantic, just thorough, like men preparing not for war but for weather. Windows latched, rifle loaded, hatchet by the hearth. The mare tied close to the back post, saddled now. In case. Just after noon, a sound came low through the valley. Not a shout, not a hoofbeat. A whistle, short, sharp, then silence. Jude froze. Thomas didn't need to ask. They used to do that when we were moving through canyon towns, Jude said. Means they've picked positions. How many? I don't know. He paused. But it's more than us. Asterisk. They weren't trying to surprise him. They were letting him know. This wasn't a hunt. It was a reminder. Thomas sat back in his chair by the door, rifle upright between his knees, the barrel clean, the stock warm from his hand. Jude stood by the far window now, eyes scanning the trees like he was trying to count shadows. They'll wait for dusk, Jude said. Always do. People feel smaller at dusk. Thomas looked to the boy, young in face, older in the kind of silence he carried. You were with them long? Long enough to stop counting, Jude answered. The wind picked up again, this time from the east. Cold air pressed against the cracks in the cabin frame like it was looking for a way in. Thomas stood and pushed the door open just wide enough to look out. Still nothing. No movement, no smoke, no sound. But that didn't mean they weren't there. He closed the door slowly, turned back to Jude. Tell me what happens when they come. Jude sat down. They'll offer terms, pretend it's fair. They'll say I owe them, or that you're hiding stolen property. You? I'm the property. Thomas didn't speak right away, just stared into the fire. Then he said, You're not. They sat in silence again, but this one felt different, like a wire pulled tight. The kind of silence before something breaks. Asterisk. By the time dusk settled, the wind had died again. The land went still. And when Thomas stepped out once more, he wasn't alone on the ridge anymore. The first man stepped out of the tree line just before the sun vanished behind the hills. He didn't carry a gun in his hand. He didn't need to. Behind him, more riders followed, slow, steady, quiet. No war cries, no laughter, just purpose. Thomas stood on the porch, rifle at his side, not raised. Jude was behind him in the doorway, shoulders stiff, one hand gripping the frame. 7 riders, no more, no less. But it wasn't their number that mattered. It was the man at the front. Silas Drake sat tall in his saddle, black duster, hat pulled low, face lean, sharp at the jaw, the kind of man who didn't need to shout to get a room to quiet. He reined in just beyond the fence line and tipped his chin at Thomas. Evenin', mister. Thomas didn't speak. Silas scanned the porch, the windows, the smoke from the chimney. His gaze landed briefly on Jude, then back on Thomas. Fine cabin. Shame to have it burn. Still, Thomas said nothing. Silas smiled, not kindly. I'm not here to trouble you more than needed, he said. Just looking to collect what's owed. The boy there, he's got something that belongs to us. Thomas stepped once down from the porch. What's that? Silas didn't blink. Time, blood, money. Depends who's asking. Thomas let that sit in the air a second. Then, he's not yours. Silas chuckled. Didn't say he was. Said he took from us. Then it's between you and him. Silas leaned forward in the saddle. That's so. Funny, I don't recall you wearing a badge of any kind. Don't see a court here, neither. Jude stepped forward then, past Thomas. You don't get to act like this is about law. Silas's smile vanished. That's true, boy, he said. Ain't about law. It's about balance. Thomas raised the rifle then. Not aimed, but present. Enough to slow the breath in every man watching. Sun's setting, Thomas said. Wouldn't be wise to push this tonight. Silas watched him, cold eyes, measured. Then he nodded once. You get your night, he said. 1. He turned his horse with a slight pull. No urgency. The rest followed without a sound. They didn't gallop. They didn't shout. They just vanished into the dusk like smoke into wind. Thomas waited until the last rider disappeared before he exhaled. Jude still stood beside him, unmoving. They'll be back, he said. Thomas nodded. I know. Inside, the fire burned low again. The cabin smelled of pine and sweat and something heavier choice. Jude leaned against the wall, eyes closed. I should go, he said. Thomas looked at him. You run now, you run forever. Better than getting you killed. Thomas sat in his chair. I already buried my wife. My boy never came home. If dying here means something for once. He didn't finish. Didn't have to. Jude crouched by the hearth, picked up the piece of wood he'd been carving all day, held it in his hand like it was something worth saving. You ever think, he said slowly, that a man can't outrun what was done to him, but maybe he can outstand it? Thomas looked at him. Firelight caught the side of the boy's face, the cut on his cheek, the years hidden in his eyes. Then we stand. That night they didn't sleep. They sharpened the hatchet, checked the locks, stacked firewood inside, whispered plans neither of them believed in fully. Outside, the night moved quiet as regret, and the ridge burned with the glow of 7 small fires, watching, waiting. At first light, the fires were gone, but the riders were closer. The fence had been cut, and the cabin was no longer a shelter, it was a target. Thomas stepped outside, boots crunching in the frost. He followed the broken posts with his eyes, not his feet. No need to walk the line. He already knew what it meant. They were done waiting. Inside, Jude had already gathered the supplies. The quilt was folded near the door, the carving knife tucked into his boot. The piece of wood he'd worked on all day yesterday now rested on the table unfinished. Thomas picked it up, turned it once in his hand. It was trying to be a bird. A small one, wings pulled in. Maybe it never would have flown. Maybe that wasn't the point. We leave now. We might lose them in the canyon, Jude said, voice tight. We can pack light, take the mare. Thomas didn't answer. He was still looking at the carving. I'm not scared to run, Jude added. I've done it before. I know. Thomas set the carving down. But this place, I've spent too many years pretending it wasn't empty. If I give it up now, it always will be. Jude nodded once, like he understood, even if he didn't agree. He pulled on his coat, tightened the straps at his sleeves, checked the revolver Thomas had handed him the night before, a stubby thing, loaded slow but reliable. I won't let them take you, he said. Thomas raised an eyebrow. I'm the one who opened the door? Mid-morning, the sun tried to show itself but gave up. Sky stayed the color of old bone, the air thin and sharp. Thomas spotted the first rider just before noon, cresting the hill like a shadow standing upright. Then another. Then 6, 7 total, just like the night before. But this time they rode closer. No campfires, no lanterns. Just hooves and cold breath in the air. Thomas stepped off the porch, rifle slung across his back, hands open at his sides. Jude followed, not close, but not hiding. The riders stopped 20 paces out. Silas sat in the middle, same black duster, same look like he'd already buried the day. You had your night, he called out. We're here for what's ours. Thomas nodded slowly. You never said what that was. Silas glanced at Jude. I don't need to. Silence fell, heavy, thick with everything unsaid. Then Jude stepped forward. I'm not running, he said. And I'm not going back. Silas tilted his head. That ain't your choice. It is now. One of the riders shifted in his saddle. Another reached for something at his belt. Thomas stepped in front of Jude. You cross this line, you better mean it. Silas looked at him. You think he's worth dying for? Thomas didn't blink. I think living means something again. That's enough. Silas's jaw worked slow, like chewing on words too hard to swallow. Then, with no warning, he dismounted. Boots hit the ground soft but certain. He walked forward. Jude tensed, reached for his pistol. Thomas raised a hand, stopping him. Silas stopped just outside the fence line. You want this to be a stand? He asked. Thomas said, no. Then what? A reckoning. Silas narrowed his eyes. Jude stepped beside Thomas again. I didn't steal from you, he said. But I left. I know what that means to men like you. You build power on fear, and fear doesn't like to lose things. Silas didn't answer. He just watched, studied. Then finally he said, You'll always be running, boy. Not if I stop here. A long moment passed, the wind picked up. It moved around them, not through them. Then Silas stepped back, mounted up. He didn't give a speech, didn't promise revenge, just tipped his hat and rode away. The others followed. No gunshots, no blood, just retreat. Thomas stood there long after the dust had settled. His shoulders sagged, but not from fear. From weight lifted. Inside, the fire still burned. And on the table, the little wooden bird waited, still unfinished, but waiting to be shaped. The next morning came soft. No wind, no tracks. But peace, Thomas had learned, was never just quiet. Sometimes it was what came after a man didn't run. Jude stood outside with a tin cup in his hand, watching the prairie like it might decide something for him. The sun hadn't risen fully, but the horizon was warming, thin streaks of gold over frozen dirt. Thomas stepped onto the porch, wrapped in his old coat. He didn't say anything, just handed Jude a slice of hard biscuit from the tin. Jude took it without a word. They stood there a long time, shoulder to shoulder but apart. The kind of silence that didn't need to end, not yet. "I carved that bird for my brother once," Jude said. Thomas looked at him. "He died when I was 10. Fever took him fast. I kept whittling birds after that. I thought if I made enough, maybe one would fly and bring him back." He gave a short laugh, small and dry. "Didn't work, obviously." Thomas nodded. "But maybe one brought you here." Later that day, Thomas hitched up the mare, took her out to the edge of the canyon trail just past where the riders had disappeared. He stood by the ridge, scanning the land, looking for signs, movement, smoke. Anything that said danger had only paused. Nothing came. Only dust curling in the air and a hawk overhead, riding the wind like it didn't care who watched. When he came back, Jude was stacking firewood. The carving sat on the porch rail, nearly finished. Thomas stopped beside it. "You gonna keep it?" Jude looked up. "You think I should?" Thomas shrugged. "I think it's yours now." By evening, they'd settled into a new rhythm. Not quite routine, not quite comfort, but something steady, something earned. Jude was inside stitching a new strap for the saddle. Thomas watched from the doorway. He didn't say it aloud, but he knew. The test wasn't about guns or blood. It was about staying. About building something when the world said it was easier to keep riding. After supper beans, a heel of bread, and boiled roots, Jude stood near the hearth and asked, "You ever think about leaving?" Thomas looked into his cup. "I used to. Thought maybe if I went far enough I'd find peace." He glanced up. "But peace isn't a place, it's a person. Or maybe a choice." Jude nodded slowly. "I want to stay." Thomas didn't reply, just sipped his coffee. Jude waited, then turned back to the fire. The snow didn't melt that week, but something else did. The silence, the waiting, the part of the cabin that had always felt like a grave. Thomas moved with less weight now. His steps weren't faster, just steadier, like the ground beneath him had stopped shifting. Jude carved most mornings. The bird was finished, smooth and sanded. He'd tied a piece of twine through the top and hung it near the window. It turned slowly when the wind caught the cracks. Thomas hadn't said a word about it, but he looked at it more than once a day. They fixed the fence, repaired the back wall of the barn, dug a trench behind the house to drain runoff before spring thaw. Jude worked with his head down, hands steady, like the land was letting him start over one post at a time. And Thomas. He started speaking more, just a little. Stories about his wife, his boy, places he'd seen before the war. Jude never interrupted. Just listened like the stories mattered. One night, Thomas handed him the piece of leather from the table. "What's this for?" Jude asked. "For carving." Jude ran his fingers along the edge. "I don't know what to put on it." "You will." Later that week, Thomas rode into town. He didn't say why, just saddled the mare and promised he'd be back before sundown. He returned with flour, a spool of thread, and 2 tin cups. Jude only raised an eyebrow. Thomas just said, "You broke the old one." Jude hadn't. but he smiled anyway. Spring teased the edge of the land, not quite warmth, but less cruel. One morning, Thomas stood outside, breathing in the thawed air, and caught sight of Jude planting something by the cedar. Not flowers, just seeds in a row. Thomas walked over. You expect them to grow? Jude shrugged. Don't know, but I figure some things are worth the try. That night, they sat on the porch. A small fire burned in the pit nearby, throwing light onto their faces. Jude held the leather piece now. 3 words carved deep and simple. Here I stayed. Thomas looked at it, said nothing, but his chest ached in a way that didn't hurt. They didn't speak of the riders again. They didn't need to. They had left a threat behind and planted something in its place. And so it was. The man who had once eaten alone now shared every meal, not because he had to, but because someone had chosen to stay and stayed still.